Hello there, and welcome to this damn full idealistic crusade. This video will be about the lost art and great nostalgia I have for movie tie-in novelizations. I'm going to go through my collection that I started really as a kid, just picking up the occasional book here and there. And since then, I've really gotten to where if I see cheap paperback tie-in novelizations, I try and pick them up, even if it's a film I'm not into, or especially if it's a very cheap copy of film I've never even seen. I think they're a great resource for film fans, and you get to see, bits of earlier script drafts that maybe didn't make it to the final film. Sometimes it's just really more of a reimagining or re-envisioning a film that you like, but in prose form. The novelization may not do a whole lot in terms of deviating from the original plot, but it gives you a more well-rounded idea because, of course, you're seeing everything in your mind's eye, which is a different perspective from the original film. And then the very few rare times where the author takes it upon themselves and is allowed to really expand upon everything and not just use original concepts or earlier versions of a film or film script, but really just take it to a whole new level, such as Peter David did in his novelization of Batman Forever. So I will go through this and every other novelization which I have, which is actually quite more than I realized. So um, stay tuned. And so without further ado, off to the lost art of movie tie-in novelizations. These are really the four that got me like firmly hooked on tie-in novelizations. And so I'm going to go through, I guess, the comic character or superhero tie-ins first, and then everything else. So, like I said before, these four really kind of are the four of the different types you're going to come across. So, the initial two books were written by Craigshaw Gardner, and his style actually works really well for these, and they read very well. But the Batman '89 adaptation is really, really great. It does have some additional sequences, particularly, it contains the horseback sequence that was to have come originally right after the scene in Vicky Vale's apartment. That turns out differently than what you get in the film. And then there was an entire daylight horse chase where Bruce had to quickly change into the bat suit and then commandeer a police horse in full costume and chase after the Joker, who basically takes the mayor of Gotham hostage along with Vicky Vale. So it's this whole elaborate sequence that basically I don't know if it was ever fully shot, but I'm pretty sure it was dropped for time and pacing, and also the bizarre look of seeing the '89 Batsuit in broad daylight. Of course, this is the sequence that Sean Young was probably practicing for on horseback when she had an injury right before production started, or actually right after production started, and then had to be replaced by Kim Basinger. As a novel, it's a really good quick read, and Gardner comes up with some really nice touches that really enriches the film, even if you've seen it 1,000 times. Unfortunately, on the flip side, when he was brought back to do the Batman Returns novelization, it's still written well and it reads fine, but it doesn't have that same sparkle the '89 book does. And of course, read both and your opinion may differ, but Batman Returns, the novelization, is much more of a, just literally retelling the film. There's a few extra details, and if I recall correctly, one or two bits that may have gotten dropped or were part of earlier script drafts. So it's never really a waste of time to read one of these unless it's not a very good film and you just read the novel and it really doesn't add anything or bring anything new to the table. So Batman Returns is a bit of a step down. Like I said, it doesn't have the real magic sparkle and all the great flourishes of the '89 novel. But that all turns around on the Batman Forever novelization, which is probably my favorite tie-in book ever. I know I go on and on usually about Batman Forever being played around with in the final editing and restructuring the opening third and removing almost all of Bruce's backstory, which is the whole point of the title, Batman Forever. And of course, the original screenplay before Akiva Goldsman came in by The Bachelors was a lot darker and intended as a direct follow-up to Batman Returns. So it was supposed to be a direct sequel to the Burtonverse. So what the novelization does, though, it's not just an example of basing something off an earlier draft, so getting an idea of what the original edit of the film was like, starting with Two-Face breaking out of Arkham and all that stuff. Um, but what Peter David does here is not only take the original ideas and a lot of the stuff that was cut out of the original film, but he just improves on practically everything. And so had the film turned out as this novel does, it would probably be a contender for the best Batman film of all time. If not the best Batman film of all time. There's bits in this book that directly recall stuff that you'd see. Like, for example, there are bits in this book that are exactly like all of the rooftop by night conferences in The Dark Knight between Batman, Commissioner Gordon, and Harvey Dent when he was still the DA. There's a lot of flashback usage in here, not just for Bruce and Batman, but for also the other characters. So basically, everybody is much more well rounded, much more three dimensionalized. And on top of that, it follows the original sequencing. Everything is improved in this, and this is one I cannot recommend highly enough. For a while, these were not the easiest things to find. I had to just haunt used bookshops, but now with eBay being so fantastically everywhere, you can dig these things up, but usually you'll have to pay $5 or $10 for the privilege if you're looking for a particular one. So it still helps to dig through used bookshops, and I know I bought a bunch at stores in the past year or two, really, because they just get mixed in with the bargain paperbacks. So some I've only had to pay like a quarter or 50 cents for, which is great, which is why I have some really random titles coming up later on. So that will explain why. So yes, Batman Forever is an example of the type of tie-in novel that is a 100% improvement on everything, but the writer basically took it upon themselves to just, put every bit of extra stuff they could into it and improve on everything across the board. Now, Batman and Robin it's kind of in the middle. It does have one or two extra scenes that are not in the film. That there's one particular one I really quite like, even though it's very far-fetched and coincidental. But basically, it's another flashback scene where when young Bruce Wayne or younger Bruce Wayne was traveling the world and having all his experiences, there's one point where he's at a college and he encounters the young Victor Fries, who while struggling with his own life issues as a, angry young man, is, taking out his frustration in, empty sports scenario like Bruce is. And so Bruce is trying to, of course, contain his talents because he's already putting up the false front even as a young man. But they have this sort of encounter that, sticks in Bruce's mind from, for what happens later on. And it's a nice little scene, totally out of nowhere, very unexpected. I don't know if it was maybe in the script draft originally or if it was just completely invented by Michael Jan Friedman, who wrote the novelization. And again, very coincidental, maybe a little on the cheesy side, but I appreciated it being there. There is some more background and some more rounding off of some of the characters. So for those who can't stand watching the film, you could probably make it through the novel okay. Definitely has less of the overt cheesiness that's in Batman and Robin, the film. But of the four, it's probably going to be the one that most people are not going to bother with reading. But I would say if you're going to get the other three, try the fourth one. It's definitely worth your time. It's probably the hardest to find of the four. I know it took me a while to find Batman Forever, and now it seems like I see it everywhere. But Batman and Robin is the one that doesn't pop up as much, probably because it was, of course, the least popular of the four. And by the late 90s, the whole boom of tie-in books really had started to trickle off, which is unfortunate, but that's why, by the mid-2000s, it was basically a niche of a niche of a niche market. Show you the backs real quick. Next up are two novelizations for Batman the Animated Series. Shadows of the Past is a novelization that combines elements of the Robin's Reckoning episodes. And I also believe it adds in the Crime Alley episodes. The animated series had a handful of novelizations. I think it's 3 that are based on the series, so I have to find the third one. And then Mask of the Phantasm had both a comic tie-in and a paperback novelization, which I really want to find. But these three, again, I'm sorry I don't have the third one, are rather uncommon. They don't turn up very often, and these are the only two I've ever found in person. But each one combines two different episodes. I believe each one combines two different two-parters. So this one is basically a duel to this is based on primarily the Two-Face episodes and two-parters. And again, they're not necessarily essential, but they are nice in that they expand upon the original episodes and give everything a little bit more breathing room and give a little bit more character development because, of course, you have a whole paperback to play around in as opposed to a network television show that then had to pass through the censorship boards. I also wanted to spotlight the novelization for Batman Begins. All three of the Nolan verse films did receive novelizations. The first two were written by Dennis O'Neil, who, knows quite a bit about Batman. And then I can't remember who wrote Dark Knight Rises, but it wasn't O'Neil who wrote that one. The other two are okay, but they basically just kind of tell the story of the film. They don't really do a whole lot. I really was excited to read the Dark Knight one, but unfortunately it really didn't add much to what was already there. But this novelization here for Batman Begins is another. This is another of my all-time favorite tie-in books. O'Neil knew the Batman character better than practically anyone, and seeing as he was the person who created Ra's al Ghul, I think he also knew quite a bit about that particular character. So while this book does follow the story of the film, it's filled with all these extra additional little side adventures and that all play into the main story, which I did really enjoy. Again, I don't know if they were originally in earlier script drafts or cut out of the film, but I haven't seen many, if any, references to these particular scenes, so I don't know if they may be exclusive to the novel. But what I enjoyed most of all is that the character of Bruce Wayne himself felt so much more well-rounded and felt so much more like what you would expect Bruce to feel like on the page, even though he is a younger character and this was starting fresh all over again. But you could definitely tell a real Batman scribe was writing the book because the whole feel of the story was so much richer. And this is one of those rare tie-in books that made me not only appreciate the film more, but I actually prefer to the film. So if I want to go through Batman Begins, I watch the movie every once in a while, but more often than not, I actually just reread this novelization because it is that good. Unfortunately, I wish the Dark Knight one had been better, but this one I think just strikes that perfect balance of telling the film story, but bringing in somebody who really knows how these characters operate, and that just adds so much in addition to all the nice little additional sequences that were not in the film. So I strongly recommend you check out the Batman Begins novel. So I do have one more Batman tie-in novelization. This one's a little bit different. This is actually a novelization of a comic book series and not of a film. So I'm lumping it in because it's the one that I do have, and I feel it's such an incredible work that I have to talk about it. That is, of course, the Dennis O'Neil novelization of the Nightfall story arc from the early 90s. I've had this copy for many years. I bought it in a library sale, so it doesn't have the dust jacket. But as you can see, the spine there. And just to give you an idea, there's the title page. And it's also cool that they use the alternating logos all the way through the book to show the character arc that Bruce Wayne has to go through as Batman in this story. When I did finally read the Nightfall story arc, it's such a long comic because it ran for well over a year across many different comic lines, that this novel is a really perfect distillation of the whole story. And I feel in a lot of ways it's actually better than the actual comic because you don't have to sift through so many different stories. And I feel up to a certain point, Nightfall, when you read it in the comics, it kind of loses its way a bit and goes on for a bit longer than it probably should have. But then again, I do want to go back and reread it again, but I always love coming back to the novel because, again, I think it's much more focused. And I think Dennis O'Neil was really great at putting Batman into prose form, which he did beautifully with the Batman Begins novelization. But I think this book is probably even better. I think this is definitely one of the best Batman stories. It's definitely one of the most important Batman stories in his entire history in comics, and I feel the novel version is mostly overlooked, which I feel really does it a disservice, as the book is really excellent, and I think in a lot of ways actually improves upon the storyline in the comics. Next up, we have the tie-in novels for Men in Black, The Phantom, and The Shadow. Now, I actually just recently found the MIB tie-in, and I picked it up simply because it was a quarter, and I'm a sucker for these things. Not to mention, it's such a wave of nostalgia, actually reading one of these that I've not yet read before, even if it's a film I've seen many, many times, like MIB. Also, it was kind of cool that the cover, the actual characters, I don't know if you can tell, but I didn't realize at first, the characters themselves and the title is all embossed, so it's all got that nice raised feel to it, which, again, it's not common that movie tie-in paperbacks, especially from the 90s, had, super fancy covers. Then, so Steve Perry wrote the novel of Men in Black. Rob McGregor, who probably most people know, myself included, for the Indiana Jones novels, or at least the majority of, I think he wrote at least, because there were several authors, but he wrote all the first ones, so I think he wrote at least half of the Indiana Jones paperbacks, which are vastly underrated, and all of them, even the ones that are not so good, better than Crystal Skull. So this is for the 96 Phantom film, and then James Luceno, who wrote a good number of later Star Wars Expanded Universe titles, wrote the tie-in book for The Shadow. Now, again, I haven't read MIB yet because I just picked it up about a week or so ago. But The Phantom is a really nice read. It does bring in a few extra elements, and it does reference a couple things from the original Phantom stories. So you do get that nice bit of extra information. You can tell the writer was a fan of the character, and the film itself, did have that serial throwback vibe and felt very much like an indie film because, of course, it was written by Jeffrey Boehm, who wrote Last Crusade. So here you have the author of the best Indiana Jones novels rewriting the script of the guy who wrote The Last Crusade. So the indie vibe is very much here. I do think some of the inherent goofiness in the film is maybe a bit better realized here in the novelization because it's a bit more on the maybe two-fisted side. It still has charm and that goofiness, and it's still the film story, but it's much more of a straightforward adventure feeling, whereas the film has a bit more of goofy humor and some whimsicalness scattered throughout. I still love the film, but you can definitely see what they're trying to do. The novel is a bit more straightforward. The Shadow is even better in that regard. While it does again retell the film story, it does bring in a lot of elements from the original pulp stories, which most people are not aware, but the Shadow and the pulp novels, which there are about, I can't remember the exact number, but there's about 300 some odd stories, almost all of them written by the fantastic Walter Gibson. But that character is really completely different from the radio series character. And it was on the radio series where they brought in all the mysticism and being able to cloud men's minds, and Margot Lane appeared there first. And it was really a different thing, even though it was the same character. So usually when people talk about The Shadow, they're talking about the radio series, and the film kind of brought elements of both in, but it was really more doing the radio series version. But the novel brings in a lot of elements from the pulp novels, because apparently James Luceno was a big fan of Gibson, and so you have a lot of references to the pulps, various characters that are not mentioned in the film, not to mention the Shadow actually has more than one alias, but his primary alias is not Lamont Cranston, it's actually Kent Allard, and that's exclusive to the pulps, and that is actually used more than once in the novel and is nowhere in the film. In the film, he's just Lamont Cranston. So I thought that was really interesting, and it's, again, one of my favorite tie-in novels, because the more I get into the pulp stories of the Shadow, every time I come back to this, I really appreciate all those extra references that Luceno put in there. With these, you can also tell the slight differences between, when more money got poured into the tie-ins. Of course, the Phantom and the Shadow were both, seen as failures, and they were also on, much smaller book labels in terms of the publisher, and the layout is a little bit more generic. You can tell the MIB copy here it's a bit spiffier, has the embossed cover. It's on a much more well-known publisher as well. I just picked this one up literally a day or two ago. So this is the Men in Black 2 novelization. I have the first film's novel, but I was not aware they did one for the sequel. So I will read this after I read the first one, and I know the second one doesn't have a very good reputation for the film and doesn't deserve one because it really just repeats the first film. But, it does have one or two gags that work. And I'm curious to see if the novel does anything different or maybe actually has more of a story to it, because the second film really did not. It was significantly after the first film had come out, and we just got basically well, for lack of a better term, a half-assed repeat of the first film. So I'm very curious. As I said, had no idea there was a Men in Black 2 novel. So I will check this out, and I'm hoping, like with all these, that it's an undiscovered gem of a novelization. Next up, we have the novelizations for the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy, and like Batman Forever, all three of these were written by Peter David. It wasn't often that this happened, where the same author wrote all of the tie-in novels for a franchise, but when it did happen, it does give a nice continuity. It's been a while since I've read these, but I do remember them being, rather nice and having a few things that weren't in the film. So, and again, by the 2000s, these tie-in novels were, they were still being made, because obviously, each of the three got one, but, it was definitely less of a focus, and you wouldn't see them as often. So if you really wanted it and you weren't, in a bookstore like the month the movie came out, they would pretty much disappear pretty quickly. So again, most of these I would see growing up, but then never got the chance to read unless they turned up in a library, and most libraries don't buy movie novelizations. Occasionally they do, or they turn up. So most of these I've had to buy secondhand, just when they appear on bookstore shelves and have super cheap, appealing price tags, and then I can't pass them up. Next, we have the novels for the first three X-Men films, and these are kind of interesting. The first novel was written by Christine Catherine Rush, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, with Dean Smith as well. I know Christine from the expanded universe Star Wars novel, I believe it's The New Rebellion, if I'm remembering the title correctly. But I haven't read anything else she's written. And then what's really interesting is both 2 and 3 were written by Chris Claremont, who, of course, is a very famous X-Men writer. So that, again, like bringing in Dennis O'Neil to do Batman Begins, the whole idea of bringing in famous comic writers to write the tie-in books, I think, is a perfect idea to get more of the sense of the original characterizations in the books. And again, like the Spidey books, it's been a while since I've read these. The first one, if I'm remembering correctly, is roughly, just telling the movie story over, but with a little bit more detail. But I don't know if you can see this. 2 and 3 are definitely a lot thicker than the first book. They're a lot longer. 2 in particular is, I believe it clocks in over 400 pages. So it definitely, 2 and 3 have a lot more detail. And again, one of the original creative forces on from the original comics wrote the second and third. And, I know X-Men 3 is no one's favorite X-Men film by a long shot, but there are a few interesting ideas in there. And I do remember the novel being a better read than the film, but again, that doesn't necessarily say very much. And then last, for superheroes, we have the tie-in novel to The Mask of Zorro. This one also written by James Luceno. And this one you don't see all the time, but it is a really nice read. Again, basically telling the film story over again, but with a few little added bits and characterizations, and similar in the way that Luceno inserted a lot of the pulp characteristics in his Shadow novelization. I did feel like there were a lot of nods to the original Johnston McCauley stories, because they are, a slightly different flavor than what most of the film adaptations do for the character. So again, I need to reread this, but I do recall it did have some of the feel of those original stories. And I'm actually now reading the original Macaulay stories finally all the way through for the first time. But when I read this the first time, I had read only some of them, but I was able to get an idea of what they were like, and it did seem like he tried to bring some of that into the novelization. So next up, I have my 4 indie tie-in novels, each novel for the original indie trilogy. There is a novel for Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. I just have never picked up a copy because I've never found a cheap enough one, and I really despise Crystal Skull. But if I do buy anything more related to it, I would like to pick up the tie-in novel. I'm curious to read it and see if it makes any improvements on the film, which I would hope that it would. I just have never picked up a copy because I didn't feel like spending $20 or more on the hardcover. And just, if the paperback shows up one day for cheap, I'll go ahead and pick that up. So I have all 4. All of these are quite good, and they hold up rather well, much like the novels for the Star Wars original trilogy. So, but what's great about Temple and Last Crusade is that they do have the photo inserts in the center, and they're very tightly bound. So I don't know how well this is going to show up because I'm trying to do this upside down, but they are full color and everything, and they have the the little captions like all these little sections would do back in the day. It's really hard to do this upside down, so I'm just going to show those. And then what's great about Last Crusade is that it's actually written by Rob McGregor, who wrote most of the Indiana Jones novels that followed in the 1990s, which are very underrated and are sort of like the Star Wars Expanded Universe. They came up with a lot of interesting ideas and backstories for various characters, tie-ins to the films, and Rob McGregor wrote the first of them, and then I believe the majority of them, and then later on it was taken over by another 2 or 3 authors before the series was finished off. But they have their fans. Some people don't like them, but I really do enjoy rereading them every year or two, and they add a lot to the indie mythos. So it's really cool that he got to write the one for The Last Crusade. And then you may be wondering why there's a book with the Indiana Jones Chronicles, or the Young Indy Chronicles moniker on it. This is titled Book One. It's a book based on, I believe it's 2 episodes from the Young Indy series, written by James Luceno, who also went on to write a number of Star Wars EU novels later on. But what's interesting is it's basically 2 episodes. I believe they were later joined together as like one of the Young Indy television movie features, or on video they were kind of joined together as like a 90-minute movie. But yeah, this was part 1 of a planned series of tie-in books that never came to pass, which is kind of unfortunate. They just did this one because it's been a while since I've seen the Young Indy series, and of course on DVD it's been recut, so you can't see the original version with the old Indy bookends, where 95-year-old Indy comes out like an old, super old, grouchy grandpa with a eye patch and everything, and says "Back in my day." But anyway, it's actually a pretty dark, much more adult toned novel than what you got in the Young Indy series. And this is, of course, based on, some of the Sean Patrick Flannery episodes with the, teenaged or young 20s Indy. So it's not like it's about, the 7-year-old Indy episodes. But yeah, it's not very common. You don't see the Young Indy books. They did a number of books for actual kids, which I've picked up some of those, but this was the one where they tried to write a legitimate novel. And James Luceno basically has written, it's a book based around, again, some of the 2 of the episodes, but it reads much more like an adult historical fiction novel, because you do have the name dropping of various people and places and events like you did in the series. But, it feels rather intrinsic in prose form. Again, it feels kind of like a work of historical fiction. So if you stumble across this in like a used bookshop like I did, I hadn't even realized there were tie-in books. Again, for they only did this one. It's listed as book one. So I was like, oh, I guess there must be more. There's no more. It's just this one. So definitely give it a shot. If you're an indie fan, I'd say pick it up anyway. Next up are my James Bond novelizations. And it's interesting, they only did them at certain periods. Not every film has a novelization. There are only a couple films that had comic book adaptations. Doctor No did, For Your Eyes Only did, and then License to Kill did, which it seems like they're very random choices, but they did a number of tie-in novelizations as well. The first one primarily being the Christopher Wood novelizations for The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker. And these are interesting kind of outliers because they've never been reprinted, so you have to track down these original 1970s paperbacks or their extraordinarily rare British hardcover variants. Um, but a lot of times what they would do is just reprint the original Fleming novels with jacket art upgraded to have pictures from the movie, and that was it. But for these, Christopher Wood actually wrote out a novelization, but instead of just retelling it in the film's style, they're almost like pastiches of Fleming, and they're written like Fleming and the book Bond placed into a similar scenario of the film's plot line, but they're much more grounded, they're much darker, and again, it feels like he was trying to write a Fleming pastiche, and they feel tonally very different from the films. I'd probably argue Moonraker in the novel form is probably a bit closer to the film because you do have some of the silly stuff, but then you also have completely new scenes in both. Some stuff that was dropped from earlier drafts, but The Spy Who Loved Me in particular feels like he was trying to write a Fleming like novel. And, for my money, this is probably the closest anyone has ever come to sounding like Fleming on the page. Since his passing in the 1960s. I've read all the continuation books many times, and Anthony Horowitz started with Trigger Mortis, which was based on, it started with a core Fleming story that had never been, never really gone anywhere. But in terms of getting that Fleming voice in the writing, this is an astonishing read if you've never read it before. And again, it's based on a Roger Moore Bond film. People have a certain image in their mind. You read this, again, there are brand new sequences in it. There's even a torture scene added to it, which fits in right with how a Fleming novel would go. So that's definitely a jarring thing. You also get some of Bond's internal monologue that you don't get in the film and that you would have gotten in a Fleming novel. So these are really, really important, and it's unfortunate they've never been republished. They were out as ebooks on Amazon a couple years ago, but I think they've been pulled. So they are floating around sometimes, but I had to track these down in used bookshops because they don't even pop up on eBay all that often. And also because they're from the 70s, they're usually pretty trashed. Then we had to wait, all the way until License to Kill for the next novelization. This was during the John Gardner tenure, which started in 1981 with License Renewed. This is actually it's a fun read. But it is also interesting in that it's definitely in the John Gardner style of Bond. My personal favorite thing is in License to Kill, Felix Leiter gets fed to a shark, and like in the novel Live and Let Die, loses an arm and part of a leg. But of course, the Gardner books were set after the Fleming novels, so it's kind of funny in that instead of just pretending that hadn't happened, Felix Leiter gets fed to the shark in the novel, just like the film, but basically the shark just eats the artificial limbs off. So it's just like, oh, well, he didn't get the real ones this time. And then they don't mention anything. So that I always thought that was really funny. You get a lot more of Bond's internal mental monologue as you would in any novel form. It's also, as you can see, it's thicker than the others here. It does have some interesting extra details that Gardner added, and there are one or two bits that may have come from original drafts, and also some of the stuff that was cut from the film that you see on the deleted scenes on the DVD and Blu-ray are in here. Plus a few other little things like how did Bond dispose of the seaplane that he stole with all the cash in it. How did he get back to Key West? Little things like that I really appreciated. And there are some nods and tie-ins to the Gardner Bonds because this is essentially the Gardner Bond character that he was writing in the 80s in the novelization. So it is a bit weird because of that, but it's still a good read and better than your average novelization because of that. Now, on the flip side, Gardner also wrote the Goldeneye novelization, and again, there was a gap between the two films because of the legal issues with MGM and Eon and trying to get everything straightened out. So Gardner was at the end of his tenure and wrote the Goldeneye novel. And this one, there are maybe a couple flashes of the Gardner Bond, but it's actually a very fun, swift read. It has some really nice extra detail about certain characters. It invents a whole backstory for Natalia and her childhood and where she grew up, things like that, which I thought was fascinating and added a lot to her character. So it made me really be able to appreciate her again after all the years of cursing her existence in GoldenEye 64. So I really appreciated that. But it didn't have that same thing where it was like the Gardner Bond in Goldeneye, whereas it was that way in the License to Kill novel. I also noticed, and this may be just me, but it's also really interesting because I reread all the books every year. Uh, Certain ones have more of a sexual element to them, and some of the sex scenes in Goldeneye are a bit more vividly described than anything else in Gardner's tenure, which I thought was kind of bizarre. This is also a better book than any of his later Bond novels, which by this point had really kind of gone off the rails. So I thought it was strange that it was such a good read when I'm so used to the last Gardner novels being very iffy at best. So I would recommend to pick that up. License to Kill is the one that you can usually find most everywhere. The 70s books are hard to find, and surprisingly, the Brosnan era novels, particularly Goldeneye, almost never show up. And then the final three for the Brosnan era are all written by Raymond Benson, as this was in his tenure that started in 1997 with his first Bond novel, Zero Minus 10. Again, all three of these I think are really great reads. Just like the Gardner Goldeneye novel, they add a lot of interesting little pieces, a lot of character backstory. In particular, in The World Is Not Enough, you get the backstory of Renard and his childhood, which is fascinating and should have been in the film somewhere. You get a bit more about his character, about Electra's character, which again should have been in the film. So every time I see the film, I miss the stuff that's in some of these. And also, Die Another Day has a great sequence that we don't have in the film where it doesn't just have Bond show up at the hotel and just waltz in after breaking out of the British frigate in the Hong Kong harbor. It actually shows him, go on the streets and, you know, um, and honestly, very much in a Bourne way. And I'm not talking about the Jason Bourne of the films. I'm talking about in the Ludlum novels, particularly the Bourne Identity of, observing criminal activities and then stealing somebody's wallet and basically piecing himself back together and getting clean clothes, but using his own wits instead of just waltzing into a ritzy hotel and doing that whole thing that we got in the film. So I appreciated that, and it is a bit more grounded. All three of these are probably a little bit more grounded because you get so much more nuance. And again, these don't pop up all the time. I bought Die Another Day when it came out, then had to find The World's Not Enough, but Tomorrow Never Dies eluded me for a long time. And again, they would just print these when the film came out, and then that was it. So for Bond fans, I recommend all of them. You pretty much need all the novelizations to have a complete literary Bond shelf, and they're just fun reads. If you're a fan of the Brosnan era and you have not checked these out yet, I must recommend that you do because there's a lot of extra nuance in there, and Benson was a very underrated Bond novelist, still is. And his novels are really, really are overlooked and undervalued. And I think his novelizations are as well. So if you love the Brosnan era films, you definitely have to check out the novelizations. So here we have the they're termed as the classic episodes, but these are the novelizations of the original series. And this pretty much goes through the entire 3-season run. And they were all originally published in smaller, very awesome paperbacks with awesome art. But what they later did, and I believe they've done it since, they've compiled them into less volumes. So these are the 25th anniversary books from the early 90s, and they just condense it down into 3 paperbacks where you don't have to have 10 or 15 books on your shelf. But the original editions are very collectible because the packaging is awesome and they're of their time period. So and I believe they've repackaged these again, so I think you can buy them new and fancier editions also in just like 3 or 4 volumes. But you can pick up these paperbacks for very, very cheap, and these are great reads. And people poured over these back in the day, of course, because before the advent of video, that's why novelizations were so important. So if you couldn't see the syndicated reruns, all you had were these novelization versions when they started coming out. And again, it's really great to have them in these collected forms, so you can just put 3 nice paperbacks on your shelf and just take one at a time in your book bag. If you want to read these on the go. The other thing is you can pick up these copies for very cheap, as you can see by these 99-cent stickers. Unfortunately, I'm still trying to get some of these off. Some are much more stubborn than others. So rather than risk tearing the cover, I'm just going to have to work at them a little bit more to see if I can get some of them off. Next up, we have the Star Trek logs. These I have picked up in their original editions because I found most of them in really awesome shape for dirt cheap, so I've been chipping away at it. I still need to get a good copy of Log 1, but finding these in clean shape that, because these are the original printings, is very difficult because these were very well read and well loved. So when they turn up used, they're usually beat up, and good copies are collectible, so they can kind of go for a bit more. These have been compiled in later editions, which I wish I had known about first, but because I probably would have bought those. But these are really cool, and I do love having the original versions. So I've got to pick up a copy of Log 1, but I believe I have the rest of them. All of these are written by Alan Dean Foster and were basically novelizations of the animated series episodes. And like the log books, they do expand a lot, but because these are originally animated shows, these really expand even more. So they're split up across 9 or 10 books as opposed to, the log books having whole original series episodes to play with. These had much smaller animated series episodes. Here we have 6, 7, 8, and Volume 9. Volume 9, they transitioned over to this cover style, so it's not available in the original style. And then all of the early books were reissued with this style of cover. So if you get a complete set, the 9th one will always be different. I can't remember right now. I'm blanking if there's a 10th volume. I think it just runs to 9. So I think I just need to get Volume 1 to round out the set. But there may be a Volume 10. I just can't remember for sure right now. And then lastly, I have the original series tie-in novelizations. Then I have all 6 of the TOS films and their novelizations. All of these either feature original poster art or promo poster art or really beautiful artwork that was commissioned, just like a lot of the Star Trek books. Then we have 5 and 6. This is the one TNG novelization I have. It's the trade hardback or Reader's Club size hardback of the series finale, All Good Things. The really great 2-parter that was the finale of Season 7 and of the series. And I just picked this up recently at a book swap shelf of, bring old books and trade it with what people have left to have just as a reading station of sorts. So occasionally I drop some extra books off there, and this was just in there, and the jacket's a little dinged up, and it's got a tear on the back, but for the low price of $0.00, this is what for the low, low price of nothing, it was a nice read and a nice way to cap off watching through the series finally. So, but I would like to try out some of the other TNG novelizations. I would guess the TNG films have novelizations, but I'm not for sure. But if there are, I will definitely check those out. Moving on to Star Wars novelizations, we'll start first with the Scholastic Junior novelizations, which I have for the prequel trilogy, and then they did a new version of the original trilogy, which I just have the A New Hope book for. And honestly, I'd like to pick up the ones for Empire and Jedi because they were written by Ryder Wyndham, who is a really good Star Wars writer. He did a lot of stuff for Scholastic, wrote all of their role-playing game books, which had really great story sections. And he's written a number of Star Wars books all throughout the past 10, 20 years. And he does have a good feel for the tone of Star Wars. So I picked this up simply out of curiosity because his name was on it and I found it in a used bookshop. So these all read pretty well. The ones for the prequels are basically, straight retellings in text form, and they have nice covers, and they all have the photo sections in the center. So, I just picked these up as a kid and eventually also got the adult novelizations. But yeah, I still keep these as I kept all of my Scholastic novels because most of them were great. I rank the Scholastic Jedi Apprentice series as in the top two or three Star Wars expanded universe works ever. The Jedi Quest series was also great, Last of the Jedi, and stuff like that. So these fit in with those, and if you have them, you'll regret not having them if you got rid of them. So, and plus there's some nostalgia because I know I read these a number of times growing up. And there's something about even if you don't like the prequels, they generally work a little bit better. They're easy to digest in text form. And again, these are fine. They're well written enough. They don't go into a ton of detail because this is the junior novelization and they're trying to hit a certain page count. But for what they are, they're actually quite good. And then these were done, I believe, in the mid to late 2000s, and they're actually a little bit thicker, but they do have the same text layout, but they do have the nice photos. But as you can see, they include special edition shots because, of course, why not? And here we have the adult novelizations, which I actually all have in hardcover form, which most of my Star Wars books I always shoot for paperback, but every once in a while I find nice hardcover copies. So these all have the nicely embossed Star Wars logos and everything. Again, if you're not into the prequels or you never liked the films that much, maybe give the novels a try. The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones books they're very good. They do expand and expound upon a number of ideas and things in the films, and some of the goofy stuff that people are really not fans of is kind of toned down. Again, a lot of this plays better in text form, and they're having, a bigger play field to play around with than the 2 hour or 2 hour 20-minute theatrical runtime. But they're good, solid reads. But the real winner here is the Revenge of the Sith novelization, which was written by Matthew Stover, who wrote a number of really great EU novels, particularly. I'd say probably some of the New Jedi Order stuff, but most for me is his Mace Windu novel Shatterpoint, which is one of, if not the best of the Clone Wars novels, and basically plays like Mace Windu in Apocalypse Now. And if that sounds appealing, please go read it because it could be a phenomenal movie. Basically, imagine Sam Jackson in Heart of Darkness, but it's Star Wars. It's like it's very dark, and he adds so much nuance, so much character depth, particularly to Anakin, but especially for Obi-Wan and his internal thought monologue. This is one of those. This is so much head and shoulders better than the film it was based on. It's not even funny. I rarely actually watch Revenge of the Sith. If I feel like going into the story, I just reread the novel because this novel is so much better. It hurts. So this is one that I must recommend. It's also got this nice cover. It's got this sort of metallic finish. I'm trying to do it in the light you can kind of see, but it's got the a version of the teaser art, but it just looks really nice, and it's really cool to have it in hardcover as well. But you can get all these for very cheap. They printed millions of these back when the prequels came out, and you can also get them in paperback. But if you were to just read one, please reread Revenge of the Sith. It's a phenomenal novelization. The back covers are a little generic, but I went ahead and showed these as well. I should also mention really quickly that Phantom Menace had a number of different covers, all with a different character. This is the Darth Maul one. So that element of collectability is there if you want to get all the different books, but they're all the same book. It just has, one has Obi-Wan, one has Qui-Gon, one has Padme, so on and so forth. I think the Darth Maul one is probably the one everybody's going to want to go for. But yeah, if you want to get all the hardcovers, you can. And here is my copy, my well worn childhood copy of the Star Wars trilogy novelizations, which were originally all published separately as paperbacks, of course, but most commonly found in books like this. And they've made fancier, bigger ones where they charge a lot more, but it's the same content. And I love the vintage art they used. I love the layout, and I've read this so many times. I'm surprised it's not falling apart. All three novelizations are excellent. They had so much nuance, so much extra depth, so much great feeling. They do feel like you're reading some sort of vintage classic fantasy science fiction adventure novel. And I find them indispensable along with the radio drama as going hand in hand with the original trilogy. So if you've not read them yet, please do. They're phenomenal. They're fun reads. You can get them dirt cheap. The original is credited to George Lucas, but it's actually written by Alan Dean Foster, who went on to write the first Star Wars novel, which is Splinter of the Mind's Eye, which was originally planned to be the sequel if they got to do a low budget sequel, because this little movie wasn't going to make very much money. um, so you do get some extra glimpses and some different viewpoints in the novelizations as compared to the films. So again, I think it adds a lot to the experience of being a fan, and you can also pick up a little trilogy book like this that gives you all three in one. So I would definitely highly recommend doing so. And then because I mentioned it, I have to bring up the book published version of the radio drama for NPR. They published a. This is literally the entire script in book form, and it's actually really interesting to read it this way because the radio dramas are just they're absolutely magical. They were all written by Brian Daley, who for me is probably the best Star Wars writer. His Han Solo novels are just an absolute magic joy reading them every time. I don't think anybody ever understood Star Wars so as purely as Brian Daley did. So he was the perfect choice to write the radio dramas, where they put back in all the deleted materials, expanded upon practically everything, because they ran 6+ hours per film. So they did a book and accompanying the CD and tape releases of Star Wars. Then they did one for Empire, and Return of the Jedi was done many years later in the 90s. And that finally came out on CD and tape. And I think that has a book as well. I just have the one for Star Wars because they don't pop up very often. Of course, if you like the radio drama, you can just listen to that. This is really more for if you wanted to see it in print form. But again, the writing is so amazing that I get a real kick out of reading it in print form. Now, starting off things that are not part of a series or franchise, this one is a bit of an outlier. This is, of course, Arthur C. Clarke's 2001 novel, which was actually written in conjunction with the film. So a lot of times it gets labeled as a novelization or as a standalone book, which it really is a standalone book, but it's really one of the few times that book and film were developed together, and they go hand in hand for the vast majority, but then the novel kind of explains a little bit here and there further, but also has some additional content. And it's also a little bit different because in the novel they are still going to the original destination of Saturn, which was changed to Jupiter in the film because it was they found out, much to everybody's chagrin, that doing Saturn and the rings with the special effects of the time was really not advisable due to the cost and difficulty and the fact they just really couldn't hack it from what reports indicate. So that's also an interesting difference. I actually read this novel growing up before I got to see the film, so I probably looked at the film the first time a little bit differently because I kind of knew what I was in for. It's also interesting to read all of this in prose form instead of the completely visual nature of the film. So if you've never read this and you're a Kubrick nerd or you've loved 2001, you owe it to yourself to read the novel. Some people don't like it because it kind of spells some things out a little bit. But again, some of the stuff's very invaluable. You get the inner monologue of even Moonwatcher in the opening. So I think it's a really important and interesting companion piece. And I think that both book and film should be experienced together. You know, see the film again, read the book again. You know, kind of within each other, and it really expands your mental perceptions of the whole story because you're getting a whole different perspective. It's very, very, very similar, but it's a different perspective nonetheless. So I highly recommend this. Now, this one it's kind of like the 2001 book, but it's also not. This is Spielberg's novelization of the Close Encounters of the Third Kind script. And honestly, it pretty much reads like you know, a text translation of the script. And I don't know if Spielberg himself actually sat down and wrote out the novel or if it was just all transposed and then, you know, he got the credit because he had the screenwriting credit. I'm not sure how it all came about, but you know, it reads pretty well. This is a copy I picked up used. It doesn't have a jacket. I think it was probably for a book club printing or something because it's got that small hardback style. But again, if you're a fan of Close Encounters, you know, you definitely got to check out the book. And it doesn't really add anything new, but again, anytime you're reading the film in prose form, then you get more nuance and you're using your mental imagination a lot more than when you're seeing the film. So it's a fun read. It's a very quick read. It's a slim volume, but doesn't bring anything all that new to the table. Now we pick up with other tie-in books that are not part of a series or comic characters or superheroes, and just kind of going through them alphabetically. Most of these I've picked up in one particular local used bookshop that's quite large, and they usually have a giant backlog of books. And I started noticing that a lot of tie-in books were being placed in the bargain section. So I started picking up a good number of them. So I bought most of these in the past month or two. So unfortunately, I have not gotten the chance to read all of them yet. So sometimes I just grab them simply if they were in good shape and looked interesting, because a lot of these particular copies only cost me, you know, 10 cents or a quarter, or sometimes even just a nickel. So their bargain section is very, very good, but you have to just, you know, it's a complete grab box of whatever they put in there. So here we have the tie-in novels for 12 Monkeys, the So here we have the tie-in novels for 12 Monkeys, 15 Minutes, the tie-in book for Braveheart, and the tie-in for The Fifth Element. Now this one, I could not get over how much it was a different experience. So this is Isaac Asimov's Fantastic Voyage, which is a novelization of the film. He was contacted to do it, and he didn't really like the science of the film and thought it was a little bit silly, and had to be persuaded into writing it, which became a nice financial success for him because the film was very successful. But he actually went out of his way to make everything a lot more realistic, to correct a lot of the scientific mistakes, particularly the one of the in the climax. You know, what happens to the shrunken submarine inside the body. All the characters are a lot more believable, a lot more grounded in reality, and I find that a big help because in the film, you know, I love the film. It's a classic of its genre, but as well directed as it is, all the stuff in the miniaturization labs and all the army barracks and stuff that they're in, it's a bit cartoony, which really kind of takes away from the drama for me, at least for the first third to half of the film. Um, I wish it was, a lot more believable. I don't have, I can totally get in with the whole shrinking aspect. I don't have a problem with that, but it's everything that comes up to that. So that's really eliminated in the novel, and it's gripping, even though you know how the story is going to turn out because you've seen the film 1,000 times. So I'd never gotten to read this until about 2 or 3 years ago, and it's a great read. It's better than the film. It really is, because it fixes some of the scientific gaps in the thinking, and it's a lot more believable and a lot more grounded, which I really appreciated. Later on, Asimov wrote a book, I believe it was in the late 80s, called Fantastic Voyage 2 Destination Brain, which it plugs it here. It's listed as that, but it's really not a sequel. It's sort of, he just goes and does his own thing, and they're also shrinking things down to eventually go inside a body, and there's Cold War tensions between the Americans and the Russians, and but yeah, it really doesn't have anything to do with it. It's just they use that as a title. So next up, we have the tie-in books for First Night, The Last Boy Scout, Metal Gear Solid. So this is the one video game tie-in that I have, and then the tie-in novel for the first Mission Impossible film. Again, unfortunately, I've only read MGS and Mission Impossible so far. I haven't got the chance to read these two yet. I'm most excited to check out Last Boy Scout, because I really love that picture. It's very underrated. Metal Gear Solid, the reason why I picked it up is I've always been interested in the series. I've played through all of them, and anything that basically is involved with anything Hideo Kojima is involved in is not going to be very easily explained. So I was curious to check out the novel. This is based around the original Metal Gear Solid story from the original PlayStation Classic. But the other reason why I wanted to check it out is that Raymond Benson was the author who wrote the James Bond continuation novels of the late 90s, early 2000s, and is an author I still really like going back to, and I reread his Bond novels every year when I do my series reread, and I think those are very underrated. They not every Bond fan is big on them, but I really do think they're quite underrated, and they have some great ideas in them. So I was curious to see what he did with Kojima's original storyline, and I think it's a nice read, and it's also helpful and trying to follow the plot line along. If you've played the game several times and it still doesn't quite make 100% sense, you have this very handy novelization. Now, for Mission Impossible, again, this is one that basically retells the events of the film, but it does have some extra bits of characterization that kind of rounds out the story. And I know a lot of people have issues with the story of the film being very convoluted, because it is a pure spy thriller. And it's not meant to be easily digested. You have to work at the mystery of the film like a puzzle box, which is not always going to equal 100% audience happiness. So if you've still been kind of confused about the all the intricacies of the film story, you can check out the novelization, which is a nice, very quick read that does help spell out some of the stuff that happens in the film much more if you read the novel after watching the film. Sometimes with films I already really like, even if the novel is the novel version is pretty much just retelling the events of the film, it's like being able to soak in the story all over again, and just pick up on even details you may have missed before because you're reading it in text form. And again, you're engaging the mind's eye as opposed to going from the visual side of things. And here we have the novelization of The Omen, written by David Seltzer. This is a book I picked up as a kid. I had seen the film before, but I kind of knew what the story is about, or I had seen parts of it, but I hadn't seen the whole film yet. This is one of those where I really enjoy reading the book more than watching the movie, and the movie is great, and I love what Richard Donner brought to it, and I love Gregory Peck's performance. I love the idea of the story. It's always appealed to me much more than The Exorcist, because of the mystery aspect of it. But I think the mystery aspect comes across much more in the book, and it basically plays out the same way, but I just love what the prose version does with it. And again, I feel like the mystery aspect and the suspense comes through. But again, I think the mystery is enhanced in the text version. So I really, I gotta say, I do prefer the book, uh, simply because I enjoy being able to, chew over all the details in my mind's eye as opposed to the film. And again, this is not knocking against the film at all, because it's a classic of its genre, and I still love the first Omen film. But I really like this book, and it's probably because I read it a number of times growing up that I still have great fondness for it. But it's really underrated, and I think it's one of the best novelizations out there. You do get some black and white stills included. Show some of those. Yeah, this it's really close between this and the film. Like I say I probably like the book a little bit better, but again, it's very neck and neck. But I mean, I love them both, if I'm honest. But I wish more people would read the novel, because it's a fun read. It's very short. You can pick it up in a used bookshop for $1 or $2. It's well worth your time. And of course, you have this really lovely, iconic cover art that just looks great on a paperback. Next up, we have the tie-in novel for the much maligned 2001 Planet of the Apes Tim Burton remake, and followed by the tie-in novel for Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, the Ridley Scott Russell Crowe 2010 Robin Hood, and the tie-in novel for Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow. All four of these were complete blind buys. I was not aware any of these had a tie-in novel. So I've just immediately put them into my to read shelf, which is quite large. So again, unfortunately, I haven't gotten to them yet. I'm very curious to see how the Planet of the Apes remake turns out in novel form, because that film is notorious for having a plot that really makes no sense. And the production design, costume design, makeup, everything in the film is brilliant, but everything else is just pretty much wacky. So I'm curious to see how the how the book turns out. And this is one of the there's two books of these four that actually have the old-fashioned photo inserts in the middle, which really had gotten phased out long before this point. So it's very rare that you actually find books that have the all-color glossy photo pages in the center. And I was quite surprised to find this. I didn't realize until after I bought it that it actually had pictures in the middle. You still see that occasionally in some of these, but not very often, particularly not later on. But then ironically, there's also photos in the Sky Captain novel. So you just never really know, because if you're not paying close attention, you might not even notice until you actually get to that point in reading the book, because it's always halfway through. And as you can see, you're not paying attention, you won't notice the very thin white line. The other interesting thing, I'm not for certain because it just uses initials, but the Sky Captain book is credited to KJ Anderson, so I would think that that's Kevin J. Anderson, who I've read most, if not all, of his Star Wars novels, and other books he's written, like Last Son of Krypton, which was a fun read. So I'll definitely check that out, especially if that is actually him doing the writing. And then the last four books I have for just standard tie-in novels. We have the tie-in book for The Terminator, for the first Tomb Raider adaptation, for Universal Soldier, and for the also infamous Wild Wild West. Again, these were all blind buys. I had never considered any of these having a tie-in novel. I had no idea The Terminator had a tie-in book. And as a novel, it's basically retelling the events of the film, but it does have a few little extra bits. Some of the stuff that turned up as deleted scenes on the DVDs and Blu-rays are in here. It's a pretty good read. Again, I find any tie-in novel of a film that I really like does have almost always some rewarding aspect, even if it doesn't bring anything new to the table. And then these three were just completely, why not? I've not even seen Universal Soldier. I'll admit that, but I bought the tie-in book. I'm just really way too nostalgic for these things. So when they turn up for 5 cents, I'm like, okay, it's in good shape. It's not smelly. It doesn't have a cracked spine, and it's a nickel. Okay, I have too many paperbacks. Why not? And then I bought the Wild Wild West one on a whim also because it was literally dirt cheap. And I was like, I'm just curious if this is any different because I saw the film on its original release. I remember the word of mouth had already gotten there. So we saw it opening week and it was already an empty theater. And yes, it's not good, but there are some quirky and cute things in it, and the original show was great. So this is a film that should have worked. So I'm going to be interested to sit down and read the novelization to see if there's anything different, see if any of it maybe plays a little bit better. So that does it for my collection of movie tie novelizations. Again, it's just something I feel is a lost art of sorts. They still exist in a certain in a certain fashion, but it's much more limited. And you usually only find out about the tie-in books. Either you either find out about it right when the film's out, or you find a copy of it long afterwards. So it's definitely not done as often as it used to be as part of a long, far-reaching movie campaign. But it's definitely something that, when done right, is really something special, and it's something I have great nostalgia for because it used to be that every movie had a tie-in book somewhere. So as always, thank you so much for watching.